Are we all ready to go? Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah. So a very good
Absolutely.
afternoon to everyone here. I, Prapti Pradhan, welcome you all to the second session of the second day of Dev Days. Last two sessions, we learned about introduction to Flutter and Dart along with navigation and routes with our expert Bhavik Makhwana. For this session, we have Aswin Gopinathan as our mentor, who is a software engineer at Accenture, and he has been working with Flutter for almost 2 years now. He is an open source contributor and he has been constantly exploring the depth of Dart and Flutter. He is also very active in sharing his knowledge with the community across different social media platforms. Today, his session is mainly based on APIs, application programming interface. He will be explaining how to work with external APIs while building their apps. I'll be the co-host and moderator for this session. A small note for all the audience. Please maintain the decorum and do not unmute yourself in between the session. If you have any queries, then please post them in chat box and accordingly they will be acknowledged by me and you will be given a chance to unmute yourself in the Q&A session. Without any further delay, I would like to hand over the session to Mr. Aswin Gopinathan. Ashwin, please.
Yeah. Hi, Prati. Hi, everyone. Actually, that was the best introduction someone gave of me. So thank you so much for that. So let me just start with the session. Yeah. So let me just share my screen. Okay, I'm having some permission issues. Just give me a moment. I may have to join back. Just give me a moment.
Yeah, Ashwin, we are on live.
Okay, cool.
You can start anything. But, it's now 51 participants are there. Yeah, you can go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you can go
Thank
ahead.
you so much. Yeah. And I'm really sorry for the inconvenience caused in between. So, yeah, as the organizer told, my name is Aswin Gopinathan. I'm a software engineer at Accenture. So, in the next 1 hour, you're going to learn about the concept of APIs and how we're going to work with API in Flutter. Okay. So, if you're a beginner to software engineering or if you're a beginner to Flutter, most of you might be having a doubt, right? What the puppy is an API? Like, what is an API in general? So let me explain it with an example. Okay, so let me, yeah. So imagine you're working with an application. Okay, I'm just gonna name it an application. So imagine you're building an application for your project or if you're for your college or something, and there's a database. The database is situated somewhere on the server. It could be a MySQL server, it could be MongoDB, it could be Firebase, or it could be anything similar. So how are you going to connect the database with your application? This is a major concern while working with the, external databases. Like in order to store data, in order to read data or anything similar, you need to connect to the database, right? So how are you going to connect to it? There are two ways. One way is using something known as drivers. The second way is our API. Yeah. So what is a driver? So driver is a piece of code. It's similar to a package in any other programming language. Even for Dart, there are packages, right? So driver is something similar to a package. It gives you all the functionalities inbuilt in it, and you just have to call the particular services provided by the package. So imagine you're working with a package for Firebase, or if you're working for a package for MySQL, there'll be classes for accessing the database. You just have to pass the keys or anything similar, and it will give you all the details. Right. So that is the driver approach. But there is actually a minor disadvantage while using drivers. The main disadvantage is actually what you say. It will bulk up your application so much because because you are adding a lot of third party packages into your application. It's gonna increase the weight of your app. So the app size might increase. Sometimes it may not, but it depends. The second thing might be you all might be familiar with the log4j issue that recently happened, right? So there are chances that the third-party applications can be hijacked and you can actually get into your application. Security concerns a main issue while working with external API, external packages. So for that, we use the concept of API. What API does is the code and everything will be uploaded somewhere on the backend, that is on the server, and you just call the code, and the code will return only those data which you want in your application. Rather than seeing rather than using any packages, you just use a HTTP or HTTPS link and you access data from the database. So that is why APIs are used. Okay, now let's get back. So that is basically API. There are two types of API responses. The data from the database is returned in two different types. One is using a JSON response. One is using an XML response. In this session, we're going to talk about only the JSON response. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, whereas XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. XML might be used in applications that Gandhiji might have used earlier. I'm just kidding. So XML is used by applications that there are legacy applications in the companies. So they'll be like it. Those applications might be developed when we were born actually during the early 2000s. Those applications used to use XML data for their API part, but modern applications prefer using JSON over XML. So this is how a typical JSON response looks like. If you're familiar with Python, you might have come across a data structure dictionary, right? Dictionaries are data structures with key and value pairs. Similarly, what we dictionary is known as maps in Dart. So that is we're gonna use in Flutter, right? So in Flutter, the dictionary data structure is known as map. So this basically is a JSON response, also known as a map in Dart. So here we can see the keys and values over here. So as you can see over here, the keys are of the data type string. All the keys will be of the data type string. It won't change ever. But the values can be different. It could be either a string, or it could be a list, or it could be an integer, or it could be a Boolean value, or it could be another JSON object as well. So in order to create an object for JSON in your Dart program, we use map. Map with the key type of string and the value type of dynamic. Dynamic means it could be any data type. It could be a string, it could be a list, it could be an integer, it could be even be another map also. So we create a data type of map and a variable of data type map, and we name the data type JSON data. So how do we access this particular value? That is A94 till AX. How are we going to access that particular value? So for that, we use the concept of the opening and closing square bracket. So the entire string is stored in the variable JSON data. Now we have to access the value for the particular key reviewer ID. So in order to access that, we use square bracket. Within double quotes, we mention the key name. So this particular variable or the data will return the data, will return the value A94 up till AX. Next, how are you going to access this particular value? So in order to access this particular value, we need to first access the entire list. So how are we going to access the entire list? We're going to use JSON data followed by the key to which it belongs. So the key over here is helpful. Next, till here, it will be a list. Now we all know how to access the elements of a list, right? We use indexing. So this will return the element at the 1th index, that is 0, 1. It will return 0. So that's basically how a typical JSON response or map work in Dart. Now let's see another example. How are you going to access this particular value? We can't directly use a square bracket of pin, right? Because we are starting from the topmost tree and we're coming deep inside. So we can't directly access using the square bracket. So we have to form a hierarchy over there. So it will look something like this. First we have to access the state, which will return another map. Then we have to access district, which will return another map. Then we have to access pin. So this will return, finally it will return the integer that is stored over here. So, I mean, that's really a very tiring job, right? You keep on writing square brackets, you keep on writing double quotes. It's very, very tiring. So, in order to overcome that, we use the concept of Podo. If you Google up, you may not find any, example for Podo. I mean, you may not find a definition for Podo, but usually, whenever you're working in many programming languages like C++, Python, Java, whenever you're working with objects, they follow a common nomenclature, that is plain old dash object. Dash will be filled by the programming language you're working on. Since you're working on Dart, I have named it plain old Dart object. So what does it do over there? Let me tell you that. So this is the JSON response. Rather than storing the JSON response as it is, we're going to use a class approach. So you might have learned your object-oriented classes, right? What is a class? What is an object? So class is like a blueprint of something that exists in the world. So the existence of this particular data is marked using a class. So in every class, there will be, data members, right? Data members are something that is used to explain certain behavior or actions of your particular class or the objects you create of your class. So when we create a class for this particular data, you need data members, that is variables that are used inside the class. So the variables will be these keys over here. So there's a key called reviewer ID, there's a key called reviewer name, helpful, right? These all will be the data member of your class. That way it will be easier to access them. Let's see how. I'm going to name this particular class, name this particular, JSON object as a class row. This entire thing is represented by row and we create an object of row using our normal syntax in Dart. Row equal to row, opening, closing, parenthesis. After you create an object for this particular class, or also known as JSON object, now we have to access this particular value. How are we going to access that? We're going to use the concept of dot operator. As I already told, we are using a class instead of the entire JSON data. Now comes the fun part actually. Earlier, when you used to access this particular key, you have to type the entire name, right? Now you are defining everything from scratch. So you can literally change the name from reviewer ID to RID. Doesn't matter. You can name a reviewer ID to my name also. It doesn't matter, as long as the value is actually the value that is returned from the JSON object. So now how will you access this particular value? We use something like row dot. I renamed helpful to H and I'm accessing the first element. right? So before I explain anything further, let me show you the code how it works. So before showing you the code, let me show you the API that we are going to use for this particular example. So this is an API that I created for some personal purpose. So this returns some data. You don't have to know what data it is returning. You don't have to know why it is used. Just understand that this is data that is hosted on the server. So this data consists of 117 rows. That's actually how the API responses are given. They always contain at least one field to define how many rows are there. Just for the sake of the developer, that's all. And the particular row key as a list over here, and the list has various elements, and it will keep on going. So let's see the first example. This is one JSON object. Then comes another JSON object and will keep on going. So what is the difference between the first object and the second object? Do you notice any difference? Yeah,
Ashwin, sorry to interrupt.
yeah.
Actually, students are not able to see the font clearly. Can you increase the font
Oh
size?
yeah. Okay, okay. Just a minute. Hope it's visible now.
Yes, yes, it is.
Cool, cool. I'm really sorry about that. Yeah. All right. So this is the first object, and this is the second object, and keep on going down. So can you notice any differences between the first object and the second object? Apart from the fact that the values are different, it's A94 over here, it's A2A over here. Apart from that difference, is there any difference between both of them? I don't think so, right? Because there's a reviewer ID, there's reviewer ID, and it will keep on going. All the keys are same for both of them. Just let me minimize it a bit, yeah. So the keys are same for both of them. So that means they are similar, except for the fact that the values are different, right? Remember, back to our object-oriented concept. So in that we learned classes are just a blueprint of something that is existing in the world. In order to use the entire class, we need to create objects. We need to create instances of that particular class. So all the instances will be having something similar except the value stored in it. So if we create a class for this particular data, all of these are called the objects of that particular class. And the objects will keep on going because there are like 117 objects over here. So this is the fun part about working with APIs. APIs make sure that the data returned from the database is organized it's organized as much as possible. The developer just have to create a new object for that and use the data. It doesn't have to organize the data in any way. So that is the main advantage of using APIs in programming languages. So now, let's do one thing. Let me create a Flutter application. It will be easier for us. So I'm going to create a new project. Let me name it something like API test. Looks fine. Yep. All right. So most of you know like how to create a basic application in Flutter. So now let me create an emulator for this. Okay, it's taking some time. Okay, it might take some time for me. Yeah, there you go. Oops. Yeah. I'm sorry if my laptop hangs a bit. When I start running the simulator, it just rockets up over. So that it's going to take some time. Yeah. So before that, let me explain you about something else. Okay. So whenever you're working with APIs in Flutter, you have to import some packages. The package that I'm going to talk about now, let's go to pub.dev. Let's search for the package HTTP. So we're gonna use this particular package in our program, in our Flutter application. So I'll just copy. Let me go with an older version so that I don't face any errors while building it. So that has built. So it's still taking some time. Mm. Meanwhile, let me just paste this package in pubspec.yaml file. So it will go over here. Oops, I think I copied something else. It's 0.0. Okay. So let's wait for this program to run. I mean, I hope everyone has understood the concept of how we're going to use the API in our particular program while converting into a Podo model. I'll reiterate again on that. We're going to create a class for this particular API, I mean, this particular, response. And we're going to use the same object over and over again because the only difference between two corresponding JSON objects is actually the value that is stored in it. Rest all looks pretty much same. There's no difference in the keys that are being used. So we're going to create a class and we're going to, all these objects over here will be actually the object that we're going to use for our Podo model. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm not on mute. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So now you might be having a doubt, like, are we going to create 117 objects for this particular thing? No, not at all. You might have learned about the concept of list, right? List is a data structure which contains a list of objects. And you might know about for loops and everything, right? So we're going to use a for loop on this particular list. And for every instance that is returned by the for loop, we're going to create an object on its own. So literally you don't have to go and type objects for each of the responses. You just have to create one response and use a for loop and iterate over the entire list.
Sorry to interrupt you again. There is a question from Harshad. He's
Yeah.
asking, will there be 117 objects or 117 classes?
There will be a single class, but there will be 117 objects for that. Because that's the main concept of object-oriented programming, right? Like you create a class that will be the blueprint, and all the corresponding objects will be created based on that blueprint. So there will be only one class and 117 objects. Hope that's clear. Yeah. So now we have created the dummy application. Now, when you're working with APIs in Flutter, you need to keep in mind two things. One, you need to use one particular one particular file for actually retrieving the data from the API. So one particular file will be calling the API and giving us the response. Then the second file will be the actual class that we're going to use. So first let me create a we'll go with the new folder. I'm going to name it services. Let me create a new dot file. I'll name it API fetch dot. So this particular class, I'll just a minute. Okay, so that was just for the package that I imported. Okay, so this particular file, that is API fetch, will contain the code for accessing the API and retrieving the response from the API. Now we need another folder which will store. Just give me a moment. Let me create another model folder. I'll name it as models, and I'm gonna name it a dot. I'm gonna create a dot file. I'm gonna name it. What can I name? API dot. Let it be. Okay. So this particular this particular file will contain the entire class that you're gonna use for the entire purpose of Podo. So first I'll write the code which will actually fetches the data from the API. So first I'll start with the HTTP package. I'm gonna use an alias HTTP for that. Now I'm gonna create a future method because whenever you're working with APIs, it's future, right? I mean, it's a future method because the API might take some time returning all the responses from the server. So there's a delay in that. So whenever there's a delay, whenever you're working on a functionality that causes a delay in the application, always use future. So, okay, my GitHub Copilot is returning something. I'll just avoid that. So let's name it fetch API. It's going to be an async method. Now, we need to access the URL. So I'll first define the URL to be this particular URL, which is going to return the API. So URL. Now we need to create a GET request for this particular API. So one thing I'll tell you, whenever you are hitting a particular URL from the browser, like whenever you're calling, let's say this particular URL or this particular URL, it's always gonna be a GET request. There are many other requests in the world of programming. Like there's an HTTP request, sorry, there's a GET request, there's a POST request, there's a delete request. But whenever you're working in your browser and whenever you call a particular, API or a particular link, the link could be something like google.com or it could be something like the API link. It's always going to be a GET request. So I copy the link, I pasted it over here. Now we are going to make a GET request. HTTP dot get of URL. So this is going to return an error because get, as you can see in the documentation, get expects a URI, not an URL actually. It expects a URI. URI, you can just create an object of URI dot parse, then you pass the URL. Alright. So you cannot directly pass the string to this particular method. You have to create an URI object and pass the URL over there. Now this particular method will hit a GET request on the API. So whenever you make a GET request, it will return the data that is supposed to be returned. So here the data will be the entire JSON string. And okay, I'll show you again. Whenever I paste the URL in the browser and I press enter, it's gonna hit a GET request. And that GET request is gonna retrieve me the entire data. So that is what is happening over here. We are acting like a browser and we are sending a GET request to the API. And that API will return the response in the variable response. I have made it final because final just means it's an immutable variable. You don't have to worry about it. You can directly go with var also. You can use var as well. But I just prefer using final because try to always create variables as final. Alright. Now we need to provide an if condition. That is, if if the API was a failure, that means due to some server issues, this particular data was not returned. In that case, you all might be familiar with the concept of 404 not found, right? So 404 is a status code which says that the particular requested item is not found anywhere. So there are multiple status codes. There's 200 which says that the data is returned successfully. Then there's 500 server issues. There are 404, 400 not found. So we need to check that first. We want to check that response dot status code not equal to 200. If it's not equal to 200, what are we going to do? That is, it was not successful and it did not return any value from the API. So we're going to say return null for the time being. It's going to give me, okay, it's perfect. Now comes to the else. Now let's come to the else part. The else part will be triggered every time the API was successful. That means whenever the response.status code was 200. Whenever it was not 200, it will come to this particular block. When it was 200, that is successful, it will come to this particular block. Now let's print this and let's see response response.body. Response is the object that is returned from the GET request. In order to access the value stored in that is the entire API, we use something known as .body. So let's call this method in the main.dart file, which is that one place where you can write all the methods in your main stateful class. You might have learned about init state, right? If not, I'll just explain, like, let me get rid of all these things, comments and all. Okay. So in the previous section by Bhavik, you might have heard about stateful and stateless classes, right? So the UI which you are seeing over here is a stateful widget. So stateful widgets are those widgets that actually change its state during the runtime of the program. That is dynamic in nature. Whenever the user interacts with your application, it will change on its own. So in a stateful class, in the main screen, I'm going to create an init state method. I'm going to call this particular method that is fetch API. Fetch API. I think it's returning. It's not defined. Okay, I have to import that particular. Oops. I imported the file and it's printing. Okay. Now let me restart this particular application. So hopefully it should print the response, right? Whatever I'm getting from the API. So let's see. Yeah, over here you can see. Let me scroll up. Yeah, it is getting printed over here. That means we have successfully gathered the API from the API response and it is available in your application. But from here, it's up to you. If you want to follow the square bracket approach or if you want to follow the Podo approach. It's all up to you right now. So let me follow the Podo approach. So what do you do for Podo? Let's go back to the API. This is the entire API from top to bottom. Let me zoom in a bit. Yeah. So this is the entire API. Now, the first thing when you're going to create a Podo class is to find the innermost JSON object. So what do you mean by innermost object? Let's see. Innermost JSON object is that JSON object which doesn't have a key, whose value is another JSON object. That means we need to find a particular JSON object. Always remember JSON objects start with the opening curly bracket and the closing curly bracket. For this entire block it will be this one, and if you expand it, opening and closing, this is another JSON object. So we need to find a JSON object inside which there is no key whose value is another JSON object. So let's see. We'll start with the outermost, that is JSON object. As you can see, there's already another JSON object inside this particular JSON object. So we'll get rid of this. We won't mind that for now. Let's come to this particular JSON object. At this point, let's see if there is any key in this particular JSON object which has another JSON object inside it. So this is a string, again string, this is a list, again string, integer, string, integer, again a string. So that means this particular JSON object does not have any other JSON object inside it. It's either a string, integer, or a list inside this particular JSON object. So you can go ahead and confirm that this is gonna be the innermost JSON object, right? So we're gonna create a class for this particular JSON object. So let me just copy this. I'm just gonna paste it for my reference so that it will be easier for me to create an object. I'm not gonna use all the fields. I'm just gonna remove some fields. Let me keep that, because we don't have the entire time, right? We don't have the entire day for working on it. So let's remove this. So this is what we're going to use for this entire session. It's going to return some error, just don't mind that. So this is the API response. We want to create the class for this particular response. Let me comment it out. Let's start with the class keyword. Let's name this class row. Now we need an object for reviewer ID. So I'll use final. It's of time string reviewer ID. Right? It's gonna return an error for now. Just I'll explain you how to remove that error. Next, we need a variable for reviewer name. So I'll go with final string reviewer name. Then I need a list for this particular value. So it will be final list helpful. Then I need final int overall. Yeah. Hello.
Raghav is having a doubt. He is asking
Yeah.
if you can explain the innermost JSON object again.
Yes, sure. Okay. So let me just minimize the yeah. So this is the entire JSON response that you got. Hope that's clear over there. This is the entire response that was returned from the API. Now, an innermost JSON object is that JSON object which does not contain any other JSON object inside it. So that means the key and value pairs inside that will be either of type string, integer, list, but it will never be a map. That is, it will never be a JSON object. So let's start from the topmost JSON object. As you can see, this is the topmost JSON object. As I minimize, this is the topmost JSON object. When I open this again, I can find another JSON object inside it. So we cannot consider this as the innermost JSON object. So now let's come to this particular JSON object. So as you can see, there is no key over here. That is, there is no key in this which will have a value as a JSON object. That means inside this JSON object, there is no other JSON object. It's either a string, it's either a list, it's either an integer, or it could be either a boolean value or floating point values. It could be anything. The innermost JSON object is that JSON object which does not contain another JSON object inside it. So when you find the innermost JSON object, we're going to create a class for that. Hope that's explained. I mean, hope you understand that part, or else I can repeat it again for you.
Raghav, is the concept clear? Yeah, it is cleared. We can move
Okay,
forward.
that's really great. Okay, so now we have created an object for this JSON, and we have created a class for this particular JSON object. Now, you already know in programming concepts about constructors, right? Like constructors are used to initialize the values of class members. So we're going to create a constructor over here. So let me just write. While creating constructors, you can use the concept known as naming parameters. I'll just write the code and then I'll explain. All right. I know it's gonna sound a little confusing, but trust me, it's gonna be easy at the end. So let me just, okay. So yeah, one thing I forgot was we need to add a question mark in front of all these variables. This is the concept of nullability in Dart. That means when we add a question mark against the data type, we're saying that this particular variable can store a null value in it. So that means imagine an API response where someone forgot to pass the reviewer ID. So that non-passing of the value will cause this particular field to be null. So that means the value that is stored in this variable should be null type. So that's why we use a question mark against this data type, saying that it could either be a string or it could be a null type. So now let's come to this constructor part. Constructors, as you all know, are used to initialize the variables inside the classes. So we have used, let me just, yeah. First of all, we have used this opening and closing curly brackets because there's a concept known as named parameters in Dart, which means that while you are creating an object, for this particular class, you can pass values to the constructor using the name of this particular variable. I'll explain this little later, but for now, just consider this as to be a named parameter, and whichever value we'll pass, we are storing it in the variable of this particular class. So that's why we use this dot reviewer ID. So since you all might have a basics of Python, it's also in Python there was something known as, I think, self or something. I don't recollect that. So it was something similar. That is, it is used to access the same object, that is the same variables inside that particular class. So this is similar to the self in Python. So now let's create a method which will return an object for us, because the entire concept is about creating an object, right, from the class. So we will return an object. So we are going to use factory row dot from JSON. It's going to be a little confusing. I'll explain how it works. So I've written the entire code and returned me some error. Yeah. So we all might have learned in our object-oriented classes, right? Like we create a class, then we create an object in the programming. Then we create object in the void main function somewhere, right? But here, this very class is itself returning an object for us. We're not creating an object explicitly using what you say a class approach. This entire class itself is returning an object for us. So let's see how it works. First, we'll start by creating a method that is from JSON. It is inside the very class, and it is called a factory method because this particular method will be run only once. For every time you use an object, this particular method shouldn't be run. So for that, we use factory and we define this from JSON method as a factory method. Now, this method takes in a JSON object. That is, this particular object is taken as input to this particular method. And now we are creating a row object of the type row. Row is our entire class. And now we are passing reviewer ID. We are gathering the data from reviewer ID key and storing it as a string. It is of the type string question mark. So we are retrieving each and every value from the JSON object and storing it as the data member of that particular object which we are creating. It might sound a little but it's confusing in between. Like when you start working with this concept, it will get easier for you. So for now, just imagine we gather the JSON object in this method. Now we are using the JSON object to gather each and every value stored in the keys, and we are assigning it to an object for its particular data members. So here you can see you are using the name colon. So that's the main reason I've used a opening and closing parenthesis while working with the class, while working with the constructor, so that you can assign values to the data members. The data member is here. Let me just, yeah. So the data member is here. In order to assign values to that particular data member, you can just use the name of the data member and assign values accordingly. This as keyword is used for typecasting. That means whatever response is returned, we are converting it to the respective data type. So this is how we create an object for this particular JSON object. Now, this is not, it's not the end now. There's one more thing you need to consider. Oops, just give me a moment. Yeah. Now, let's go back to the API. We created a class for this particular response. So what will we do for this, the remaining part? What will we do for all these objects? So as someone had asked earlier, are we going to create 117 objects for the same? Yes, we're going to create 117 objects for this particular API. But you're not going to manually do it. You're going to use a for loop. For that, I'm going to create one more class. I'm going to name it rows. So this is the plural form and this is the singular form. So this will this will contain a list of type rows. Sorry. Okay. It's going to contain a list of row items, that is row objects. Again, I'm going to create a constructor and I've passed it over here. Now let's create a factory method. This time it's going to be rows dot from, it will be from a list, right? Because we're passing a list of we're passing a list from the API and from there we're creating objects for that. So it's going to be of type list. I'm going to name it API response. All right. Now we need to return the rows object. I think some issues. Oops. Yeah. Now this is something that we're going to return. We're going to return an object of type rows. That is the class rows. So here we're going to use an approach known as API response dot. We're going to use map. What map does is, when you're working on a list, map will perform certain action on each and every item in the list. That means, for example, you pass a list that contains 1, 2, 3, and you invoke the map method on a list. What it will do is, for every iteration, it will contain a value. It will return a variable. That means, like imagine a list that has, let's say, 1, 2, and 3. So we are using a dot map approach on this particular list. What it will do is it will perform certain action. Let's imagine this is the action that is going to perform over here. This dot 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 is an action that is going to perform on each element. So what map does is that it will invoke each element, that is 1, 2, and 3 separately, and store it in the variable e. And for every e, it will perform an action. So that means if I perform this list dot map, E will contain 1 in the first iteration, it will contain 2 in the second iteration, and 3 in the final iteration. So for now, we are using the list API response. And what does this list have? This list has an object, JSON object, which you can see over here. So this entire list has multiple JSON objects. So what are you going to perform? What action are you going to perform on that particular list? I mean, that particular JSON object. We're going to create a row object for each of those response. Let me show you how. So when you applied a map on this list, in every iteration, the variable E will store each of these JSON objects. So this particular loop will run for 117 times because there are 117 objects in this particular list. So in every iteration, the variable E will store each of these JSON responses. So what are we going to do for that? We're going to call row dot from JSON. Let me remove this for now. From JSON. This is the method that we had used in the previous class. This takes in a map, that is this entire thing over here, and then we return an object of type row. So for every iteration, that particular JSON object goes to the above method and it returns a JSON row object, and now we need to convert into a list. So we use to list. So it might sound little confusing, but I'll explain once again. So this entire list is returned from the API. So that was stored in this particular variable API response. Now we have applied a map on that particular list. So whenever you apply a map method on a list, it will return a variable e. It will iterate through all the elements in the list, and in each iteration, the element e will have the element at that particular index. So if the list was 1, 2, 3, when you apply a map method on that, each variable in every iteration e will contain 1, then in the next iteration 2, then in the final iteration 3. And for every iteration we are performing some action. So in this particular variable API response, the individual values were the JSON object which the API returned. This is the entire JSON response. So this is what is returned by the API by the variable in every iteration. So what do we do with that particular response? We're going to pass it to the previous class, the method from JSON, and we're going to create an object for that particular response. So it will return a row object. Finally, after all the iteration is done, we convert it to a list because we are using a list of row, right? So this is how you create the 117 objects for your entire API. You create a class for a single API response, then you use a map or a for loop approach to create objects for all the classes. I mean all the JSON object you have in your API. Now that's the most important part. You fetch the API response. I'm sorry, someone asked me like which part should I reply? Explain.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Hi, Ashwin. I was not able to understand like once we have created a variable e,
Yeah.
and every time we are overriding with the old value, with the new value,
Yes.
and then what's going to happen with the new value? Like can you please walk me through the code once again?
Yeah, sure. So I've given an example over here, 1, 2, 3. So whenever you apply a dot map method on this particular list, what it's going to do is in every iteration, each value is going to be stored in E. That is, in the first iteration, 1 will be stored in E. Then 2 comes, and in the final iteration, 3 will be stored in E. But during each iteration, you're going to perform some action on that particular variable. You're not going to do anything. You're not going to just leave it as it is. You have to perform something for every iteration. It's like using for loop in I equal to 0, I less than n, I plus plus, right? And in each iteration, you're gonna write something like print I, something like that. So this is similar. Here we don't have to use something. You don't have to write something like array.I or something, because every time E is gonna store this particular values in that particular list. So you don't have to worry about writing array of I or something like that. So in every iteration, each value is going to be stored in E, and we are performing an action known as creating an object for that particular JSON. So as I told earlier, this list contains a list of JSON objects. All these things over here is JSON object. So if I expand one, it is a JSON object. So this particular list, that is API response, contains a list of JSON objects, and for every iteration, that means for every JSON object in that particular list, we are converting it into a row object, which we are going to use in our program, because that is the main motive of Podo models. You create object for the API response rather than using the API response as it is. So that is how this map method works. Hope that clears it out.
So map method is like lambda function in Python. Can you say that?
Yes, yeah, something similar. It's like I think lambda function was something that is anonymous, right? Something
Yes,
similar.
yes, yes. one
Yes,
liner
it's,
function.
yes, exactly. It's similar. So it's, I mean, in Dart also it's known as lambda function itself. So yes, it's similar.
All right. Thanks a lot, man. Thanks a lot.
No problem. Happy to help. Yeah. So now we have created the, what is a list of rows. That is list of row objects. Now all the tough part has got over. Now just we can focus on the UI part. Backend is completely done. Now let's focus on the UI part. So what are we going to do in the UI? Let's print all the data, all the values that is stored in the data, and that is returned from the API. So let me remove these comments. I'm going to place myself on the top. Yeah. Let me remove this floating button and all. These are all the boilerplate code that you're going to get when you're creating a new project in Flutter. So let's go ahead and remove this center widget. Perfect. Okay. Now, first what we have to do is, first we need to call the API fetch program. Then, I mean, API fetch code, that is the fetch API code. Then we have to call the API.dart file. But here, let's make sure that we return the rows object rather than passing the actual data. So we create an object of type rows equal to rows dot from list, and we're going to pass response dot body. Okay, just response dot body, which will return the entire API. Then we're going to use the key rows because that contains the entire list. So we know, right? Like we have to use what is say square bracket and everything. But this is going to return an error because body is of type string. Let me show you once again. Body is of type string over here. So we cannot directly use the square bracket approach on this particular string. So we have to convert the string into a, what is a JSON object, that is map. Okay, let me close this. Yeah. So for that we create a variable called map of type string dynamic. I'm going to say JSON response equal to, we're going to use a variable called JSON. It is available in the Dart convert package. JSON dot, let's say decoder. I'm just confused a bit. Decoder, what does decoder do? I think it's encode, sorry. And we're going to pass response.body to it. It's not encode. Okay, I'm sorry, it's decode. It's, yeah. So let me just, yeah. So what decode method does is that you're going to pass a string to the decode method. It's going to convert the string back to a map type. Map is similar to the JSON object in Dart. So it's going to convert the string to a JSON object. Now we can use JSON response dot. We're going to use this particular key because it returns a list, right? So rows. Now everything should work because we are passing a list to the from list method and everything is magic over there. It's from here the list is going to be converted into a list of JSON object, a list of row object, and it's going to return this particular row class, that is a row object, and we are storing it here. Now let's return this rows. All right, now let's go back to the main.dart file. Since we are working with an external API, it's a network call because we are calling the API from the internet. So that's the main reason I have given here future and async and use an await to get the response, right? So whenever we are working with futures, we follow the concept of future builder. We use a future builder widget. It requires a future method. So the future method will be the fetch API. and we're gonna write a builder for this. It will have context and snapshot, right? So what future builder does is it always takes in a future as its input and it waits for the future to get over. Once it is over, this builder is run. Yeah, like it's something like, let me show you. Let me write one more thing. Okay. Now, API fetch.dart. This is the method that we're going to run to gather data from the API. Right. Now, since it's a future method, that means it might take some time to return the data. Because whenever you're working on the internet, whenever returning data from the internet, it usually takes some small delay to gather the data. So for that particular delay, you can't make your user to wait for that particular time, right? It's called asynchronous programming in Dart. That means whenever you're working on something that takes some time for returning data, you can perform something in parallel. It is called asynchronous coding in Dart. So in Flutter, we have a widget called future builder, which will take a future method, and the builder will be run. But how will we know whether this particular method has returned data or not? For that, we use the variable snapshot. Snapshot contains a data member known as has data, which says whether this particular method has finished running or it's still running. So if snapshot.hasData is true, that means this particular method successfully ran and we got the rows object. If it has not run, then we have to write something in the else part. So what will we write over there? We write a circular loading progress indicator. We are going to create a circular progress indicator. Whenever you're working with, let's say you have come to YouTube and your video started buffering. You might have seen something going round and round over there, right? So that is a progress indicator. So whenever your application is fetching data from the API, you have to show the user something so that they can wait over there. So for that, we show the circular progress indicator over there. So this particular code is run only when your API is still under the progress of fetching data. It has not finished yet. When it has finished, the if condition will be run. So in that we return something known as center. For the time being, let's write something like text of future ran perfectly. Alright, now let me restart this code. So you can see a circular progress indicator over here. It's still running. It might take some time to fetch the data from the API. Let's wait for some time. Usually it doesn't take time. I don't know what happened. Let's wait for some time. Okay, I mean there was an exception. So what was the exception? List of dynamic can be. Okay, let's check it out. Okay, this should be of type. List of int. No, this. Let's name it dynamic for the time being. No. Sometimes no. I mean, working with variables can be sometimes difficult. So I think that's done. Let's restart. Okay. Hopefully it should work. Again, it gave me some error. What happened now? Overall, let me see. Overall, it's an integer. Let's remove it for some time being. Let's run it again. Hopefully it should work. No, again. Okay. Sometimes while coding, it's an unpredicted thing. These bugs and all. Timetable is not. Let's do one thing. Let's remove this final overall. Please work this time. Okay, now it's working properly. So as you can see, once the API was fetched from the server, this else part won't be run again. Then it will come to the if part. And in the if part, we are written something like text future ran perfectly. Right. So this is how, I mean, this is what happened over there. So as you, now you might be having confusion like, I mean, how is this builder working over here? Because earlier it was going with the else code. Now it has run the if code. It completely, I mean, it's against what we learned in our coding classes, right? In our coding classes, we learned either the if condition will be executed or either the else condition will be executed. But this builder is like a for loop. It's like an infinite for loop. So in every iteration, it's checking whether the snapshot.has data is true or not. In every check, if it is false, the circular progress indicator is shown. So it's like what to say? It's like frames in a video. You never know how many frames went through you and went through while displaying the video. You're just happy with the video, but none of you counted the frames, right? So it's something similar. This it's like a frame. It kept on going, and in every condition we're checking whether this text should be shown or the circular progress indicator should be shown. So till the data was not returned, progress indicator was shown, and once the data was returned, this future text, I mean text was returned. So let me write a print statement. It will be similar. It will be easier for you. Let's write IITM. Let's restart again. So see, it's going on. It kept on printing until this if condition was satisfied. So it's like a for loop. It keeps on going, and in each condition, it will check whether the data is returned or not. If the data was not returned, circular progress indicator will be shown. If the data is returned, the text will be shown. All right, but we need to print the actual data, right? So let's go about and create a list tile. Sorry, a list view. List view takes in a list and it will print whatever content is there in the list. I'm gonna use the builder method of that. Now, list count. Okay, before that, we need a variable to store the response that was returned from the API fetch method. The response was of type row. So rows, sorry. So if will be snapshot.data as rows. Hopefully it should be correct, right? Okay, I have to import. Where was the import? Yeah. So once I've imported, it's working fine. So whatever API, whatever response was returned from the the fetch method, we are storing it in a variable called rows because it is whatever we return from the method where of type rows, right? So we're going to store the same thing over here. Now, while working with listview.builder, you need to pass the list count, item count, sorry, item count. It says how many items you want to build. So we have the rows variable dot rows dot length. Perfect. So where does this rows come from? So let's go back to the main class. This is the object that we returned. It contains a data member called rows. We are accessing that. It is again a list of row. So we are using the dot length approach, I mean dot length variable for that to return the length of the particular row. So whenever you're using null safety, that is, whenever you have used question mark for defining your variables and you're getting an error like this, always write a exclamation before that. It will remove the error. Now we have written item count. Now we need something that will build the entire UI. So we use item builder. This will take context, index, I know it's GitHub Copilot is sometimes irritating. Okay, return list tile. All right. Now, what I did was, and let me remove this. We need an UI to display the contents in the returned value, right? So we use a list tile. List tile is used for defining. It's an UI element. I'll show you how it looks. But list tile has attributes title. So for that, we're gonna print text of rows of index dot we have how many variables did we have? We had 4 variables, that is final reviewer ID, reviewer name, helpful, and overall. Let's print reviewer ID. So it will be reviewer ID. Reviewer ID is of type string. Okay, just give me a moment. What happened? Okay, let's give you a question. Okay, let's see what happened. Okay, this should be over here. Hopefully, right? Rows of no, it should be over here only. What is this error then? Okay, showing it cannot be null, it seems. Okay. And whenever there's an error, something like this, that is, the method can be unconditionally invoked because the receiver can be null. Whenever this null thing comes over there, always make sure you add the exclamation mark so that we are telling the compiler that it won't be null. It's never null. So that is why we use the exclamation mark over there. Now let's try to restart this code. Wow. It's just printing everything that the API returned. We're just printing the reviewer ID, that is this reviewer ID from the API. It's returning the entire response and only the reviewer ID of the entire response. Let's try something on a subtitle. Text of rows. Then we use the index operator dot this time reviewer name. All right. Exclamation. Now let's run again. So this time it's printing the name also over there. All right. So this is how you actually gather data from an API and expose your UI with that data. So I've just used a basic widget UI over here. You can go ahead and create very beautiful applications that you find online. So for every application you use in your mobile, it could be Instagram, it could be Twitter, it could be WhatsApp. All of those data which you see in your app is actually returned by an API. It's not actually you don't go directly into a database and return in your program. You use an API to fetch data from the database and populate in your application. It's like how you populate the data. The limitation might be your imagination. Like it depends on how you imagine your UI to be. So if you are good at if you're good at the UI design part, you can create beautiful design using the basic API that is returned from the response. So that is basically about how you use APIs in your code. So let me say, did I miss anything? No, I guess. Yeah. So this is all this is all we're going to discuss in this particular session. But there are a lot of things you can explore. There are plenty of APIs out there. So let me show you an example of an API. Let's say, not this, sorry. Yeah. let's say there's one site called Rapid API.
Ashwin, Shubham this side.
Yeah.
Can you, if it is possible, can you share this code with all of us?
Yes, definitely. I'll be uploading it on GitHub and I'll be sharing the code soon.
Yeah, that will be great. Thank you very much, Ashwin.
No problem. So I was talking about Rapid API. Yeah. If you're curious about various API that is out there, go over to rapidapi.com. Then you can find a lot of APIs in this. Let's say it's API Hub. Yes. So you have flight data APIs, you have free SMS API. There are a lot of APIs you can use for your application. There's a Google Play Store API which will return all the data about all the apps in your Play Store. Open Weather Map API is something that I like the most. You can create beautiful weather applications using the actual weather API. It is up to date and you can actually literally create a beautiful weather application for your city or for your college or something similar. All right. So let's get back to the session. I explain the code. But now, if you want to connect with me, uh, I'm the most active on Twitter, so you can follow me on Twitter using the handle @Gopinathan Ashwin. Or if you're very curious to know, and if you're very curious to connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram, just Google search Ashwin Gopinathan, and you can literally see all the social profiles that I'm active in. So with that, I would like to end this session off to the organizers. I'll be sharing the code right now. Just give me a moment.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ashwin. The session was really wonderful. Now we are having Q&A session. So if anyone want to ask something, you are free to unmute yourself or raise your hands. Better you raise your hands. We will give you chance and you can clarify your doubts. Harshit has raised his hand. Harshit, you can unmute and ask your doubt.
Hi, Prapti. Thanks, and
Yeah.
thanks, Ashwin. Thanks for the opportunity. I wanted to ask about the factory method. So factory method runs, it runs only once. So does it only runs for the first time when we execute our code, or can we select our own time? Like it should run after a couple of methods. Like how does it work? You're on mute, Ashwin. I can't hear you.
Uh,
Yeah, I'm audible now.
Yes,
yeah,
Ashwin.
yeah.
So I was telling, for our use case, we don't have to run all over again because we're just returning an object over here. That is an object of type row. So that means we don't have to run this method over and over again and increase the what is a heap memory of your. I think it's the heap memory. I don't remember that, but we don't have to increase the memory of your application by running this over and over again. We just have to run this method only once in every iteration. Always note that it's going to run only once, but in every iteration. So if there are 117 objects, it's going to run only 117 times. You don't want it to run over and over again for every iteration. Because the sole purpose of this method is just to return an object once. That's all. I hope that clears it out.
Can you like kindly explain this method row from .json? The factory method, like how is it being used in our application?
Yeah. So this is the API response, and
Mm-hmm.
as you can see over here, this is one JSON object. So we have whatever we do for this JSON object, we have to replicate it over 116 other objects as well. So uh, let's consider this particular JSON object. We take this JSON object and pass it to this method that is from JSON because it is taking a JSON object as its input. After you take this particular response, you have to create a class object which will contain the values for reviewer ID, reviewer name, helpful, and overall. So, in every iteration, each of these JSON object is passed to the method, and that value is stored in the object attributes. Attributes are reviewer ID and everything. So we are literally taking it from there and storing it in the class and returning an object of that class. That is why we have used from JSON method.
You told that in the beginning that you're using question marks to
Yeah.
indicate if there is no value mentioned, it will be null. So can we
Yes.
use default values instead of null values? Like, what is the advantage of using a null value in this case? Why can't we have another value as a default value?
Default value, yes, you can go with default values. So for that, you just remove the question mark and write here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is how you write default values. At that time, you don't have to use question mark over there. Question mark is used only when there's actually there's a chance that null values can come, but you don't have any default values for that. You are happy with having a null value for that variable.
Okay,
So
okay.
okay, this I can have to remove. Yeah. So this is how this actually a concept of null safety in that.
So in this API fetching application, how is null value coming into picture? Like
Yeah. In this API, I don't think there'll be because I don't know. Like I'm only able to see the top 10, right? Because I can't go and check every response. But what if the database, what is the API that is returned? Someone actually forgot to provide values for, let's say, summary. There's no summary at all for that particular item. So this will turn out to be null. In
mhm.
that case, null value can be returned because all the APIs are not perfect out there. Some APIs, I mean, let's say you're working with a data science project and there is an empty area, that is some fields or rows or columns are empty. There's no particular value for that. So what do you do? There will be some other. You will go. You will find the average of other method, other rows, or something like that.
True,
But while
true.
working with applications, you can't go with an average approach, or you can't possibly do any actions on the missing values. So for that, missing values will be represented by null, and that's how null can come into a program.
I see.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot, Ashwin. Thank you.
you're welcome. No problem.
Anyone else having any doubt?
I'll ask one more question if that's
Yeah,
all right.
sure, sure.
So do you work as a Flutter developer or as a like what is your job profile as?
Yeah, I'm actually a software engineer at Accenture. Apparently, Accenture has not adopted Flutter yet, so I'm a .NET developer at Accenture. But Flutter has been my love since the time it started. So in my part time and whenever I'm sitting idle, I just work with Flutter.
Okay. And what market prospect do you see for a Flutter as compared to a Android developer or an iOS developer? Like what is the current prospect for an Android Flutter
Yeah.
developer? And why do
So
we
yeah.
yeah, and why are people not going towards Flutter? Like what is adoption rate for Flutter in the industry as compared to like people who are just focusing more like we can see that there are iOS developers as well as Android developers in the market
Yes.
as well. But
Yeah.
Flutter is something which can solve, which can create I mean, cross hybrid applications. Then why are
Absolutely.
people not adopting Flutter at such a rate? Like, and what future prospects do you see?
So for the first question, future prospect, I would say that Flutter is gonna be the next big thing. But I'm not gonna say that it's gonna replace the existing native developers because they have their own way of doing it. I'm not gonna say Flutter is gonna replace them, but it's gonna coexist along with them. So that is the main. I mean, it's up to the developer and their budget, like how to use, whether to use a native approach or whether to use a Flutter-based approach. But trust me, most of you might be using Google Pay, right? Earlier, Google Pay was built using Android for Android phones and iOS for iOS phones, but the current version of Google Pay is built using Flutter. So you can say that Flutter is actually widely being used in applications, especially Google Play, which has millions of user base. So at the end of the day, it's up to the developers of the organization whether they would like to go with a native approach or whether they would like to go with the Flutter-based approach. But there are a lot of disadvantages using Flutter. Like sometimes, whenever you're building a Flutter APK, the size of the APK is very huge. Like if I write a basic Hello World code in Flutter and build an APK, it will be close to 15 to 20 MB. Whereas while working with Android APKs, native Android APKs, it will be close to 2 MB or 5 MB. I don't know if it has changed or not, but earlier when I used to work with Android before Flutter came, it was close to 2 MB or 5 MB. So the size is something, and there are plenty more things like having native calls. Like while working with Android, it's like working with the root of the application itself. So when you're working with native, it's like you're working with the root of the tree. You're starting from scratch. But when you're working with Flutter, it's like there's a layer on top of the root, and you're just focusing on the UI part, or you're focusing on making it beautiful rather than considering the root of the application. But with latest developments, Flutter is actually becoming very stable. It's like it's very, I mean, it's comparatively very good compared to Android and iOS. Plus, now it can be used for developing web applications. So if you are very confused about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you can literally learn Dart and create applications out there, web applications. You don't have to burn your head learning CSS. You don't have to burn your head learning JavaScript. You can just learn Dart programming language and build web applications. So yeah, hope I have cleared all the questions. Did I miss anything?
There is one more question from Sundram Sontirki. He's asking how can we send data to API like username, password to server for validation?
Yes. So earlier I talked about the GET request. GET request, what it does is you can just gather data from the API. You cannot send anything from there. But in what do you say, in the world of internet or in programming languages, you have a concept of, you can use post methods which you can use to send data to the API via the via the headers and everything. There is delete API, sorry, not delete method, which will send your credentials so that you can delete data in the database. Data in the database. Then there are more methods like put. So except get, rest all you can send some data to the database, and you write the server side code for handling all those things. Yeah, hope that solves the question.
Yeah, I think we are done with Q&A session. Raghav is asking to share the code.
Yeah, I'm just sharing the code. Give me a moment.
Yeah.
Also, Ashwin, if let's say somebody is starting out with application development, what do
Yeah.
you suggest? Should one first learn Flutter and then go for something related to maybe learn Kotlin or Java?
In my opinion, if you are a Flutter developer, you should have some basic knowledge about native development as well, because it doesn't matter if you only know Flutter, because as far as I know, I mean, at the end of the day, you're gonna work with Android and iOS, right? So it's better to have an Android or an iOS knowledge while working, even if you are a Flutter developer, because that's gonna help you a long way. That's very, and if you're looking for jobs in India, make sure if you get a chance, try to learn iOS development, because iOS development is something that not many people, let's say, not many Flutter developers explore. If you're comfortable using developing an iOS application, learn that. Or Android is also perfect, because every organization, if you go to the job description, they will obviously mention Flutter over there, but they'll be like they also require you to have a basic knowledge of native development. It could be either Android using Kotlin, or it could be either iOS using Swift. So yes, that's, yeah. Hope I've answered that.
So first learn Kotlin and then or maybe iOS, Swift,
The
and
order doesn't matter. You can do it parallelly, or you can do either Flutter. Then first you start with Flutter, then go with native. It doesn't matter over there.
okay. All right. And when you talk about basic knowledge, like how much in like what do you mean by basic?
Of native development, right?
Yes, yes.
Basics could be something like you should be able to understand the code base. Even if you don't know how certain packages work, you should be in a position to Google search that particular package and get an idea of how it's working. So, I mean, in that position will be a very good point for you. Yeah,
Thanks, man. Thanks a
no
lot.
problem. Yeah,
So I can't see any more questions. So I think we have reached to the end of the session.
yeah. I'll
Thank
just
you.
share,
Thank you.
share the
Yeah.
code. Just,
Yeah.
let me stop the share.
Yes.
Mm, yeah, stop sharing. So I have shared the code for this particular session in the chat section. You can just go over there and access the code. So anyway, you can connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to help you out. So yeah, off to you, organizer. You can continue.
Thank you so much, Ashwin. The session was very insightful. I hope everyone learned many things from this session. So, dear audience, stay connected with us. The day is not over yet. We are lined up with the another amazing session at 5 p.m. today on native plugins with GDE Damodar Lohani. So, stay connected for more updates. We would like to sign off for now. Happy learning. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashwin, again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Uh, Host, you can end the meeting.
Okay, yeah.